This is the last mile of our sustainability marathon. Welcome back to the Sustainability Imperative. And thank you for joining us for a session now, our last track on leadership in action. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Over the next hour, we're going to hear from some fantastic leaders from the world of business, from conservation, from transportation, and fashion on what they're doing to promote sustainability. But before we get underway, just another friendly reminder to tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill Sustainability, all one big clump, The Hill Sustainability. We're broadcasting live and I'll take your questions. If you experience any trouble with the live stream, please refresh the page and that should fix it, I promise. To kick off the hour, I'm pleased to now welcome Sally Jewell. I always enjoy speaking to Sally Jewell. Sally formerly served as the Secretary of Interior under the Obama administration. She currently sits on the board of the Nature Conservancy. She was a former CEO of REI. In fact, she just tweeted out a commendation to REI. She says, "Thanks for taking leadership position on sustainability and moving past offsets to carbon reduction across the supply chain." So that was kind of fun. Well, Madam Secretary, it's great to see you again. You know, we have had a very wide aperture in this discussion over the last 3 days on who we've talked to, how we've looked at what sustainability is. And it occurred to me, because I had the privilege of interviewing Congresswoman then Deb Haaland and now Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. And I thought, knowing we were going to speak about what's changed in the ecosystem of this discussion since you were serving in your role in the Obama administration to today. And I'd love to get a snapshot, because I sort of feel like there's been a shift, like people are more moving towards, seriousness on climate. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Steve. When I took over as Secretary of the Interior in 2013, it was right after the 2012 election. And President Obama had been cautious about using the term climate change because of the polarity of public opinion and the disputes and the denial that were out there. So I jumped out of the private sector and into the administration, in part because working hard on sustainability as a business leader, leading the outdoor retailer REI, I knew that we did not have the capacity to make change on the scale necessary as an independent actor or with the outdoor industry or even with the apparel and footwear industry, that we needed government. And so it was difficult to actually begin to address that because of the kind of shell shock of the public discourse around the 2012 election. After President Obama's Climate Action Plan speech in June of 2013, the picture changed, and that was really critical. And I think since that time, it has just become more and more obvious to the public that climate change is real. As young people continue to enter the workforce in large numbers, they care about this. They're pushing universities, they're pushing their businesses. And thank goodness, because we are in real trouble and we've got to accelerate it. So yes, it's a different time, and thank goodness it is.
Sally, another thing that's come up over the last 3 days, and I'm really pleased that it did, but it's awkward because we've been talking about, across the sector, what we can do on climate, Glasgow, et cetera. But a lot of sustainability is not just climate. It's about the environment. Other dimensions of the environment. It's about biodiversity. It's about nature more broadly. And I talked earlier today with M. Sanjaya, and the CEO of Conservation International, about a federation I love that the Nature Conservancy, which you were helping to lead recently, was also a part of, and it was called the Campaign on Natural Security, on other dimensions of nature that are part of this. And I asked him, why doesn't biodiversity, why don't birds, why doesn't the forest get as much time as climate? And he said it's come down to carbon and the measurability of carbon, but these other dimensions are important too. How do you look at this equation of the broader dimensions of nature, and are we underserving those in our discussions as we focus on sustainability?
Well, I think we're beginning to talk more about them. This effort called 30 by 30, preserving 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030 is a movement in that direction. But it's not just any 30%, right? It's the right 30%.
Right.
And so I think the environmental community is beginning to get its act together with a single voice that says it's about protecting the best, but also improving the rest. So with each passing month, I'd say, we have a greater appreciation of humans as a part of nature and how we fit within the whole biodiversity and ecosystem that is this planet. And we now know there are far more interdependencies between the health of human beings and the health of the planet, whether that is pollinators that are so essential to pollinating the crops that feed us, to the challenges of climate change and hurricanes and droughts and floods and wildfires that impact our lives directly, and our food supply and our biodiversity indirectly. So I think that there is a great awakening. But I'd also say, one of the things that happened when I was in government, as we looked to repair from Superstorm Sandy, if you remember that, of course, there have been many storms since that time, but was how do we use not just gray infrastructure, but green infrastructure? How do we learn from Mother Nature on things like mangroves and wetlands and natural dunes, and not building right up to the edge of the beach, and being smart about natural climate solutions? Certainly sequestering carbon, taking carbon out of the atmosphere is a big one, but it is also about resilience to our habitat, resilience for ourselves, for our communities, but for those critters all over the world that don't have a vote, that are important to our future, and whose lives are tied to ours, but ours are also tied to theirs.
And Sally, I noticed in this September 2020 tweet about REI that you praised them for moving towards carbon reduction in their whole supply chain as opposed to just buying carbon offsets. Yesterday, I talked to Ann Finucane, the vice chairman of Bank of America, and she said that's a nice goal, but you got to have carbon offsets, at least in a major transition. B of A has committed to go carbon emission neutral across all of its clients, which is, he says, it's huge by 2050, as many firms are doing now, and that the financialization of this ability to trade offsets, et cetera, is a real vital part of that. Do you agree with that? But I just also want to say, do you agree with that? But while you agree with that, how heavy a lift is it to move to what REI has done with carbon reduction?
Well, let me say, REI is, when I was running REI and I started my role as CEO in 2005, we put a major focus on sustainability. And part of it is, like, if you are in the business of engaging people in nature and the outdoors, you better be sure you're part of the solution and not part of the problem. And that means understanding what your impact is. So we did a huge assessment with people across the organization saying, what's our impact on the biosphere? And what can we do about it? And I said, I want to be, and it's just, sort of carbon neutrality and all that wasn't being talked about. I said, I want to be planet neutral by 2020. Well, of course, 2020 was last year. And REI said, Sally set this goal, we got there, but they did use offsets to get there, because it takes an enormous effort across the business sector to be able to drive renewable energy, to get a more circular system, so it's not just make waste, as has been said by Bill McKibben and others. And you can't do it alone, and you can't do it without a years-long effort. So I think that your Bank of America reference is absolutely accurate. Offsets play a role, but reducing your usage to begin with. So the best electrons are one you don't use because you've got an efficient building. You've switched to efficient lighting. You've switched to efficient refrigeration. You're not using hydrofluorocarbons and other pollutants. So there are things that are moving quickly, but not quickly enough. And so buying offsets and encouraging trees to continue to grow, encouraging lands to be maintained in their natural state, to use things like regenerative agriculture to keep carbon in the soils, all of these things, which can be sold into carbon markets as offsets for the time being, are an important tool in the toolbox until we truly reach a time where we can be carbon neutral in our energy supplies, in our products that we make, and so on.
Let me ask you a global question and a kind of historical context question. I know that John Kerry was in Bangladesh the other day. I think he's been in China either yesterday or the day before. So he's out there trying to coordinate leadership actions towards Glasgow in the next climate round. Gina McCarthy was talking to us yesterday. The Biden administration is clearly talking about a whole of government response on climate. But as the rest of the world looks at Glasgow, it looks at this, do they look at the United States as a serious player given the fact that we had an administration that went so far the other direction in the last 4 years? Now we've kind of, turned a light switch and gone the other direction. Do we have credibility problems in being kind of an international messianic force on climate?
I think that the world recognizes that our system can swing back and forth. So are we considered a less reliable player than before? Perhaps. And I think it is up to all of us as Americans and as leaders to demonstrate that we want to aspire to what people used to think of us as being. And I think we have work to do in that regard. We have to lead through our actions, not just our words. And as you know, Paris was a start. And John Kerry's been very clear on that. And, I was a colleague of his at the time that the deal was struck, and it was not enough. And he used to use the phrase, there is no planet B. I'm sure he still does. I'm not sure if he coined that, but it's accurate, and it wasn't far enough. And I think the thing that will regain American credibility around the world is if we're willing to put hard goals out there and hold ourselves accountable to it. And what that looks like is aligning our own policies that unlock business innovation in service to climate change and addressing these challenges. And that absolutely can be done. So are we going to show that? Are we going to lead the world as we did on clean air and clean water back in the 70s with mileage standards in cars, which began to change things around the world? Are we going to get back to that? Because there are ways to do this that will present business opportunities and employment opportunities. And that is how we align human interests, economic interests with environmental interests. And I think that is the sweet spot we've got to hit as a world, and the U.S. can lead.
Sally, just finally, you're a very rare person. You're sort of this hybrid of having been a cabinet secretary, having been a private sector CEO now. You were CEO of a major advocacy group, NGO, in this space. So you could just talk to yourself from these different things. But, given your understanding of talking across these lines, do you have recommendations for, as we have people from the private sector listening, people from the Biden administration listening, on how to talk across these different frames that, different parts of this equation have? You represent all of them, it just occurred to me. But I don't think everyone has that same set of experiences. Are there any kind of tricks of the trade that you find helpful in getting folks from different corners of this conversation to understand each other better?
Yes, it is about listening, authentic listening, and developing respectful relationships. And what I have found is that when you develop a one-on-one respectful relationship with someone that is maybe going to peg you in one camp or another, and you may be pegging them in one camp or another, and you get to know them as individuals, you recognize that no one gets out of bed every day, no matter their profession, saying, I want to damage the planet. I want to create an unsafe, unsustainable future for my grandchildren. And I am a grandmother now, and I think about that. Nobody wakes up saying that. So how do we listen to each other and find those intersections of interest, that common ground? And I would say, one of the things that disappointed me over the last 4 years is the Obama administration actually worked quite hard with oil, gas, and mining interests in thoughtful regulation that would begin to align those who were doing the right thing with policies that supported and enabled that. And so many of those sensible regulations, like not venting and flaring methane, not letting the taxpayer royalties and things not get counted, those things that would have rewarded good actors that were doing the right thing, even in the energy, oil and gas, fossil fuels, mining sector, doing the right thing, you didn't want to put them at a competitive disadvantage. And so many of those things were rolled back over the last 4 years. And that's really frustrating. And I think it undermines trust between those who were at the table negotiating and those that did not support those sensible rules over the long term. So there's some trust that needs to be rebuilt, but my sense, having been in all those sectors, and I started my career as a petroleum engineer in oil and gas, is that it's about listening. And then it's about sensible, thoughtful regulations that reward the right kind of thing. And that's what we need to get back to.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that with us. I think it's so important to get these groups to talk with each other, and I'm grateful every time we ask you to come on and tell us how you do it, that you do that. Sally Jewell, Global Board Member of Nature Conservancy, former Secretary of the Interior. Hope you're well, and thank you so much for sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Steve.